Let me begin by asking you a question. Suppose you're in your later years, an old man about my age, and though you don't realize it, you only have about 5 years yet to live, and you've loved God your whole life. You've served Him, not perfectly, none of us do, but your life has been devoted to serving Him, teaching about Him, doing everything in your power to glorify Him. And you have a beloved son. And as a son grows up and becomes an adult, unbeknownst to you, he begins to use your resources to turn your friends against you. He begins to spread wicked rumors that you are a rascal, you are a villain, and that not only should you be driven out of town, literally, but you should be put to death. This is your son now we're talking about. What do you do? What would you do? And maybe some of you recognize the scenario that I've just described because it comes from the life of David in his later years. And the son we're speaking of course, is his beloved son Absalom. You can read the story in 2 Samuel chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, right through there in that section. And it's a horrible story. It's a tragic, heartbreaking story. And David was literally run out of Jerusalem. He had to flee for his life. And as he's leaving his beloved city, there are some who throw rocks at him, who curse him, who call him a son of Belial, which we've spoken about before. And it's just horrible what's going on. So instead of asking me, what would you do? Let's ask the question, what did David do in this circumstance? And the answer is found in Psalm 3. So if you take a look at Psalm 3, it says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. So what did David do? He wrote a psalm. He writes a psalm. The rest of us be wanting to call the police. We'd be wanting to call our friends to correct all the misunderstandings and the rumors that have been running rampant. We would want to do everything in our power to fix the situation. But what does David do? He writes a psalm. One of the things I want us all to realize as we study the book of Psalms, that these are 150 psalms, 150 statements of truth. And the way you fight lies, the way you fight wickedness, and the way you do spiritual battle, and this was a spiritual battle that David was in, is always with the weapon of truth. The sword of the Spirit is the word of truth. And so David would address situations by truth. And if we can do what David did, when we come to a very difficult time in our lives, and we will all have them, is to sit down and focus on what is truth, what is reality. If we can set emotions and fear aside for a moment, if we can set aside the current events and the situation as it appears to our eyes, and rehearse what truth is, we will conquer fear and we can win the battle. And Psalm 3 has a lot of information for us that will help us in this struggle we constantly find ourselves in, where we are doing spiritual warfare. Now, in the last Psalm, Psalm 2, it begins with, why do the nations rage and the peoples meditate emptiness? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against Adonai and against his Messiah. And it goes on about how the nations are in an uproar. But here in chapter 3, it's not the nations, it's David's own household. And there's this statement in the Talmud from the tractate Berachot 7b, a rebellious child in the home is worse than the battle of Gog and Magog. And this statement in the Talmud is made on Psalms 2 and 3 because they see Psalm 2 as being prophetic about the war of Gog and Magog. Yet in chapter 3, we see David doing warfare in his own home, spiritual warfare. He never lifted a finger against Absalom. But God had dealt with Absalom because, I believe, of David's faithfulness and David's loyalty to the truth. So let's continue reading. Adonai, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Let's start with the word foes. I'm going to introduce you to 4 Hebrew words in this psalm. 4 Hebrew words are used more in the book of Psalms than in any other book of the Bible. And the first one is the word here that is the word foes. It comes from the singular word zar. Zar. Zar really means something that is in a very tight and restricted place. Something that is very hard. When we use that expression between a rock and a hard place, think zar. It's very similar to the word zor, which is a word for rock. And in fact, when if you recall the story of Moses when he was heading back to Egypt, his wife Zipporah was with him and his 2 sons, and along the way Zipporah circumcised their son. And it says she took out a flint knife, and the word used there is this word, zor, something hard. So some translations put foes, some will put tormentors. They'll render this different ways. But all of them can be summed up in this. They are in a very tight and hard and difficult and impossible position. When you find yourself in that position, that's the word zar. That word is used more in the book of Psalms than in any other book of the Bible. In fact, it's found 33 times in the book of Psalms, so we'll be revisiting this word many times as we make our way through our studies. So he says, how many are my czars, my foes, my tormentors? Those things are making life so hard for me. Many are saying against me, I should put my glasses on. Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, of my nephesh, there is no salvation for him in God. That word for salvation is the word Yeshua. And yes, it's like the name Yeshua, our Messiah. Now, Yeshua's name does not have the hey on the end. It's just Yeshua, and that's the name. But when it's used as a noun, which means rescue or salvation, it has the letter hey on the end, but it means exactly the same thing. We read in the Gospels that before Mary gave birth to Yeshua, an angel appeared to Joseph and says, you shall call his name Yeshua because he will yashea his people from their sins. So the very name Yeshua, Jesus, means salvation or rescue. This word is found 45 times in the book of Psalms. It's found in 3 places in this psalm alone. And so I just counted up the number of times it's used as a noun. I didn't even count up the times it's used as a verb. But rest assured, it's used more in the book of Psalms than any other place. Because in so many of David's circumstances, he's calling out to God for his Yeshua, for his salvation, for his rescue. And then verse 2 ends with the word Selah. We don't know what this word means. There's a homophone of this word. It's spelled differently but pronounced the same, which means to make light of. And there have been some suggestions by the rabbis that it is a word that can mean eternal, but in the Psalms, we don't know exactly what it means. It could mean you pause here. It could mean that you repeat. It could mean this is where you insert the guitar solo. We don't know. And personally, when I read a psalm aloud in a group, I don't read the word Selah, since we don't know what it's used for, what it means. but it's some kind of an instruction to people when they're singing the psalm as to what they're to do. Well, we just simply don't know what it means. And this word also is found more often in Psalms than in any other book. It's found 75 times in the Bible. 71 of those times are right here in the book of Psalms. It's also found one time over in the book of Lamentations and 3 times in the book of Habakkuk. But all the rest are here in the Psalms. So it's some kind of a musical notation that has to do with singing in some way. And so anyways, the argument goes on about what it really means, but we don't know. If I find out, I'll tell you. And as we go on, we end the first 2 verses, which end a section, and that's possibly why the word Selah is used there. Because the first two verses are talking about David's present circumstance, the pain and the difficulty he's in at the moment. But in verse 3, the tone changes. He says, "But you, Adonai, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head." God's a shield about him. God is his glory and the one who lifts his head. I cried aloud to Adonai, and he answered me from his holy hill. That word shield is the word mogan or mogain. And that is what it looks like in Hebrew, mogain. And again, it's used more in the book of Psalms than in any other book. It's used 19 times in the book of Psalms. And right below it, I drew a Star of David because in Hebrew, the Star of David is called the Mogan David or the Mogain David and the Shield of David. So when you hear of Mogan David, I know there's a wine, a kosher wine called Mogan David, but Mogan David's referring to the Star of David, the 6-pointed star. No one knows exactly where this symbol comes from. There are many theories about it. But one of the things I find interesting is that if you count the small triangles around the outside, there are 6 small triangles with a large area in the middle. Some suggest this is a picture of the 6 days of work that sit around the Sabbath, which is in the middle. It also is a picture of 2 triangles. One triangle is pointing upward, the other triangle is pointing downward. The upward pointing triangle would be us. The downward pointing triangle would be God. And we are superimposed upon each other. And as we seek him and draw near to him, he draws near to us. And what's the result? A star, a source of light in a dark world. So there are many insights and ideas around this unique symbol. Some people want to say, oh, it's an occult symbol, we shouldn't use it. Maybe it was. But you have to remember that if it ever was an occult symbol used by the enemy, where did the enemy get it? Because the enemy is a thief, and everything he has, he stole from us. He stole from God. And according to the Torah, a thief always must pay back at least double what he takes. So I'm tired of allowing myself to be robbed by the enemy. And so if this was an occult symbol, I simply don't care. I'm taking it back. And I'm going to use it so that when we see this, we don't think of something occultish or satanic. I think of the Jewish people. I think of the shield of David. I think of the light in a dark world. I think of the 6 days of work and the day of rest around which they center themselves. So I encourage you to. Don't be a victim of pagan noia and allow the enemy to rob you of everything. But give things new meanings and redeem them back and use them for God's glory. Well, let's continue on. I won't take quite this much time on the rest of the psalm. Now, if I was in David's circumstances, I'd be pacing the floor at night. I'd be trying to sleep and, not being able to rest and relax. But what does David do in verse 5? I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. In other words, my son who's wanting to kill me, he didn't get me. None of his friends came in and attacked me and took my life in the night. I lay down and slept, and I woke up. God protected me. This is real faith. Now, this took place later in David's life. We think he was about 65 years old, and we know he died around the age of 70. So he had walked with God for quite a while. His faith in God was great. And so he could sleep at night, even when these horrible, horrible things are happening to him. This reminds me of Peter over in Acts in chapter 12. Peter has been chained up in prison, and he probably expects to be executed the next day. And you can read about it in Acts 12, verses 6 and 7. It says, "Now when Herod was about to bring him out on that very night, Peter was sleeping." He went to sleep like a baby, just like David did here in this psalm. He was sleeping, and not just sleeping, but sleeping between two soldiers bound with two chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. Behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands. So even Peter, when faced with pretty certain death in the morning, he could sleep because his faith was in God. He rested in his protector, his shield. Verse 6. It does not say here that I was not afraid. He said, I will not be afraid. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. One of the things I find most concerning in these days is the lack of courage in people, especially in people who call themselves people of faith, who are believers. We should be fearless. As George MacDonald wrote, fear is illegal for the believer. If you're a believer, you don't fear. If you're fearing, you're not believing, because faith and fear cannot dwell in the same place. The only thing we are ever to fear is to God himself. That's a holy, loving fear. But when we give our fear to anything else other than God, we're giving something to others that belong only to him. We're robbing of God of what belongs to him and giving it to something else and saying, in this case, that is God more than God is, because I fear that more than him. Our faith in God should be so strong that he is the only one to whom we ever give fear. And it's not a fear where we're necessarily shaking in our boots, but it's an awe. It's a love and respect that our only concern is that we would ever disappoint his great, loving Father's heart. So let's not give to other things what belongs only to God. Let's fear him and him alone. And if we fear God, we don't need to fear anything else, because he's the one with whom we have to do. He's the one who runs the world. He is our master and he is our king. Nothing else is. So I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. And I suggest that in the margins of your Bibles, you put Psalm 91. Psalm 91, a wonderful psalm that is worth memorizing, and is a psalm to be read whenever you're tempted to be afraid. And then the last two verses form the final section. It's David's prayer of truth. He says, "Arise, Adonai, save me, O my God." Save me is Yeshuani. It's that word Yeshua again, but in a verb form. Yeshuani. Save me, rescue me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. That sounds pretty violent, but it's poetic expression of two things. You strike my enemies on the cheek. He strikes them. That means they can't talk anymore. You break out the teeth of the wicked. That means they can't bite anymore. There are only two ways an enemy can affect us. It's through their talk, where they destroy our character, and it's through physical pain, physical hardships they bring us, like biting, and they cause physical harm. Speech, and physical harm. How else can anyone hurt us? But God strikes them on the cheek, now they can't talk. He breaks out their teeth, now they can't bite. God can deal with our enemies. So we should cry out to the Lord instead of crying at the enemies or just crying in self-pity. Cry out to God. And I mean literally cry out to Him. I'm going to suggest an exercise to you that I have found works so well. I learned it from a rabbi, and whenever I do this, God rises up and helps. And it's a way of crying out to God silently, because sometimes you're in a place where raising your voice would be alarming and it would not be appropriate. But inside, in the silence of your own soul, you can cry out to God. You can scream out to Him and truly do this internally. And when you cry out to Him, God, help me, you'll be amazed at what happens. And then we come to our final verse. Yeshua belongs to Adonai, and there's our word salvation once again. Yeshua, rescue, salvation belongs to Adonai. We look to so many things for our rescue. But there's only one thing, one person we really need to look to, and that is our Lord and our Master. Yeshua, salvation belongs to Adonai. Your blessing be on your people. And then it ends with a final Selah. When we started our Psalm studies in Psalm 1, which opens with Ashrei Ha'ish, contented is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, stands in the way of sinners, or sits in the seat of the scorner. Ashrei means contented, not blessed. But here, this is the word baraka, blessing. What is the difference between blessing and contentment? It's this. Blessing is God's choice. It's His option. But contentment is ours. God can bless, but contentment is something we choose. It's something that we take steps to be. So I want God's blessing in my life, and that's His to give, and He does in so many ways. But contentment is something I must choose. And when we get to the end of this psalm, it would appear that David is choosing contentment when everything around him is in chaos and turmoil. I want to finish this psalm with the first word. The first word of the psalm at the top, where it says a psalm of David. We learned that the word for psalm is the word Tehillim, and so this series is called Tehillim Talks, Psalms Talks. But Tehillim is not the word used here. The word for psalm used here is the word mizmor, which comes from the word zimmer, which is a song. This psalm is a song that David wrote. And when you expect him to be crying, filled with self-pity, filled with fear, filled with turmoil, what does he do? He writes a song. Because David had walked with God long enough to know that amidst the sorrows of this life and the unfairness and the persecutions and the zarim, the attackers and the hard things people bring against us, he knows that even the most beautiful songs have some minor keys, some sad chords, but there's still a song. If we can just expand our perspective, instead of getting tunnel vision caused by fear and concern, step back, stretch out the perspective, and begin to realize that God controls the world and everything happens within His will, we can not only be blessed, we can experience contentment. We can write a song in the midst of chaos. Remember, these 150 Psalms are 150 portraits of truth, statements of truth, weapons of truth. And truth is our weapon against whatever comes against us. So let's learn how to use it. Thank you for watching this teaching, and I look forward to meeting you back again as we look at Psalm 4. Shalom.
That's all I have to say.